Well, it was the case that affirmed the legality of a woman's right to an abortion under the US Constitution. Earlier this month, a leaked draft majority opinion suggested that the Supreme Court was set to strike down the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling. It sparked protests in cities across the US, with hundreds of rallies taking place again this weekend. Well, to discuss this and more, we're joined for today's perspective by Gail Sredanovic, a member of the Raging Grannies activist organisation. Good to have you with us, Gail. So tell us firstly, for viewers who may not be familiar with your group, who are the Raging Grannies and how did you yourself end up getting involved with the movement?
Well, we are a group of mostly older women activists. Younger women are welcome to join, but in fact, most of us are older, 50 and up. And the group started, the notion and the name started actually in Canada in the 1980s. And our group started in Palo Alto in the year 2000. So we've been hard at it on a number of issues all around the Bay Area and sometimes a little beyond since then.
And Gail, you're looking really stylish, joining us this morning with the hat and the outfit. Very elegant there. And the group, it's always taken an imaginative approach to protest, hasn't it? Do you think that helps to get your message across using political theatre, as it were, to fight injustice?
Well, absolutely. The costume and the fact that we sing satirical songs are definitely help to reduce the level of resistance and make people feel less threatened. And in some cases, we've actually been able to be a protective barrier between the police and other demonstrators who might have gotten rougher treatment. But so long as there's a press there to beat up on someone who looks like us and is dressed like us would be a terrible photo op. So we usually feel pretty reasonably safe.
And Gail, has your group been joining the recent protests that have been happening right across the US with abortion rights supporters coming out onto the streets?
Oh, yes, for sure. To my knowledge, there were Raging Grannies in San Francisco, and also our group took part in a sizable protest in the local city of Mountain View, which is still in Silicon Valley.
And is it something that you thought 5 decades on from perhaps when some of you grannies were out on the streets demonstrating back before the 1973 ruling, did you ever think that we'd be back where we are today with these protests taking place again right across the US?
Well, we certainly didn't think so then. I think we felt that it was settled, and our justices also, when they were being evaluated, claimed that it was settled law, but now it seems it's not. And we have been worried for a long time about the rise of this very authoritarian, male-dominated, white supremacist faction in America, which unfortunately seems composed a lot of evangelical Christians.
Can you take us back, Gail, to the campaign, as it were? If we can go back 4, 5, 6 decades, were you part of the protest movement before the Roe v. Wade ruling?
I definitely was part of protests, but not on this particular issue. To my knowledge, this was mostly changed through legislation and lobbying, although I could be wrong. I certainly took part in anti-war protests, and I took part in free housing protests. I, walked the neighborhoods and handed out literature and marched. And also I took part in anti-nuclear protests. So I've been a protester for most of my adult life. But on this particular issue, I can't say that I recall.
And Gail, just on this particular issue then, how has the fight for reproductive rights in the US evolved over the past 5 or so decades? And what are your concerns for the future if this landmark ruling is struck down by the Supreme Court?
Well, so far as I know, it's evolved, in the legislature and through persuasion. But for the future, I'm very, very concerned because this is going to lead to a lot more deaths. Already, the clampdown on abortion based on the time or the duration of the pregnancy has already in several states led to a significant rise in maternal mortality. For sure, if legal abortions are banned, abortion will still go on and more women will die. And many of them will leave behind families and other children. Half of the women who seek abortion already have children who depend on them. So if their mother is lost, it's a terrible blow,
And,
besides the loss of the woman's life.
of course, and just in terms of how politically toxic this issue is, many Americans do support, in theory, a woman's right to have an abortion. Do you think that this is getting caught up with various other issues that are currently, a part of the debate in the US at the moment? You mentioned
Well,
white
yes, I
supremacy.
think that there is a strain of this militant white supremacist philosophy, which includes banning abortion. Oddly enough, it also includes not wearing a mask as a violation of your personal liberty, but it's okay to force a woman to carry a child, which is actually a threat to her life. A legal abortion is much, much, much safer than giving birth, especially if you're African American.
And remind us then just of how, what the atmosphere, what the climate was like before we had this ruling back in the 1970s. What kind of risks were women facing then, as opposed to the kind of risks that they may be facing today?
Well, there's always a risk with pregnancy and childbirth, but in states with good medical care, and especially if you're white, the risk is pretty minimal. It's much worse if you're in certain states where insurance is not available, healthcare is almost unavailable, and there's discrimination against women and persons of color. So it's very risky in those situations. And this also has an effect on the child that's born, too. When there's poor medical care, the infant mortality rate is also very high. In both maternal and infant mortality rates, the United States record is shameful, I'm
And
sorry to say.
And Gail, do you think, we've seen hundreds of protests taking place since that leaked draft opinion was published on the Politico website. Do you think that these rallies, that these demonstrations, that they're likely to make any difference to what's going to happen at the Supreme Court?
We never know. It's just axiomatic of the work that we do, that you get out and you do what you can, and you use every lever of power that you can, and hope for the best. You never know whom you have influenced and at what time for sure. At least you usually don't know. We do know, for instance, that Trump was turned from being pro-choice to being, favoring a ban on abortion by certain evangelicals. So that's one instance we know how the influence happened. But generally, when it's benevolent influence, we're not too sure who was responsible. We just do our best. Many of us also work in other democratic political arenas, lobbying our legislators and raising funds for the better candidates, and telephoning on behalf of candidates, texting, and all that stuff.
Okay, Gail,
We do. Most of us are active in other spheres.
Great. We'll have to leave it there, Gail. But thank you so much for your time this morning, for joining us here at France 24. That's Gail Sredanovic, a member of the Raging Grannies activist group. Thank you.
Thank you.